Did you know that in the early days of the United States, only a small group of people were allowed to vote? It's hard to imagine now, but voting rights were very different back then. In this video, we're going to look at how voting rights in the U.S. have changed over time. We'll explore who was allowed to vote at the beginning, how different groups fought to have their voices heard, and how these changes shaped the way we vote today. We'll start by looking at voting in the late 1700s, when the country was just starting out. Then we'll see how voting rights expanded in the 1800s and early 1900s, including the fight for women's right to vote. Next, we'll talk about the Civil Rights Movement, which made voting fairer for Black Americans. Finally, we'll look at what's happening today and the challenges that still remain. Let's go back to the late 1700s and see who could vote when the United States first began. In the late 1700s, when the United States was first founded, voting was a privilege reserved for a select group of people. Only white men who owned property were allowed to vote. This meant that many people, including women, Black Americans, Native Americans, and even white men without property, had no say in elections. The idea back then was that only property owners had a stake in society and were responsible enough to vote. Each state had its own rules about who could vote, so rights varied depending on where you lived. But one thing was clear: the right to vote was far from universal. As the U.S. grew, so did the push for change. By the early 1800s, more people began to question why voting should be limited to landowners. This led to changes in many states that dropped the property requirement, allowing all white men to vote, regardless of whether they owned land or not. This shift was a big step, but it still left out large parts of the population. Women, Black people, Native Americans, and other minorities were still excluded from the voting process. But change was on the horizon, and movements would soon arise to challenge these unfair practices and demand a more inclusive democracy. Next, let's look at how these movements started to grow and the fight for voting rights gained momentum. The fight for women's right to vote began to take shape in the mid-19th century. Women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and many others dedicated their lives to changing the system. They argued that women deserved a voice in the same way men did, and that society could only improve if women were part of the political process. In 1848, the first major step was taken at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. This was the first women's rights convention, and it sparked a nationwide movement. Over the next few decades, women held rallies, wrote speeches, and lobbied lawmakers. The struggle wasn't easy. They faced criticism, ridicule, and even arrest. Despite these obstacles, the movement kept growing stronger. Finally, in 1920, after years of hard work and sacrifice, the 19th Amendment was ratified. This amendment granted women the right to vote. It was a huge victory for equality and marked the start of a new era in American politics. The 19th Amendment changed the political landscape, but it didn't mean that every woman could vote without issues. Black women, Native American women, and other minority groups still faced discrimination and barriers at the polls. The fight for voting rights was far from over, and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s would be the next major push to make voting truly fair for everyone. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was not just about ending segregation. It was also about ensuring that Black Americans and other minorities could exercise their right to vote without fear or unfair obstacles. Even though the 15th Amendment had granted voting rights decades earlier, discriminatory practices like literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation still kept many Black Americans from the polls. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and countless activists worked tirelessly to bring attention to these injustices. They organized marches, protests, and voter registration drives in the face of violence and harsh opposition. One of the most powerful moments was the Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965, where peaceful protesters were met with brutal force. This event, known as Bloody Sunday, shocked the nation and highlighted the urgent need for change. Public outcry from these events pushed lawmakers to act, leading to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This landmark law aimed to remove the barriers that had long prevented Black Americans and other marginalized groups from voting. It banned literacy tests, provided for federal oversight of voter registration in states with a history of discrimination, and ensured that voting rights were protected. The Voting Rights Act was a major victory that helped make voting more accessible to millions of Americans. It marked a turning point in the fight for equality, showing that when people came together and demanded change, progress was possible. However, even with the Voting Rights Act, the struggle for fair and equal voting rights would continue into modern times, with new challenges and debates shaping how Americans vote today. In the years after the Voting Rights Act, progress was made, but challenges remained. Over time, new laws and court decisions like the 2013 Shelby County versus Holder case weakened parts of the Voting Rights Act, allowing states to change voting laws without federal oversight. This led to debates over voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and access to polling places. These changes have sparked discussions about how to balance election security with voting access. While progress has been made, the fight to ensure equal voting rights for all continues to this day. Today, voting rights continue to be a topic of debate. Some laws aim to make voting more secure, while others argue they create barriers for certain groups. The push for fair access, early voting, and mail-in ballots has sparked new movements and discussions about how to keep elections both secure and accessible for everyone. While voting rights have come a long way since the early days, the journey is not over. Modern debates focus on voter access, new ID requirements, and ensuring elections remain fair. Activists, lawmakers, and communities continue to work toward a system where every eligible American can vote without barriers. The fight for voting rights is ongoing. Despite progress, new challenges arise, including laws that impact voter turnout and access. Efforts to expand voting options and protect against restrictions show that the push for fair and inclusive elections is still very much alive. As we look to the future, the importance of protecting voting rights remains clear. Ensuring that every citizen can participate in elections without unnecessary obstacles is crucial for a healthy democracy. The story of voting rights in the U.S. is one of resilience and continuous effort, reminding us that progress often requires constant vigilance and action. This brings us to today, where voting rights continue to evolve. With technology playing a bigger role in elections and discussions around election security, the focus is on how to balance accessibility and trust in the voting process. As history has shown, each step forward in expanding voting rights has come from people standing up for their voices to be heard. The journey of voting rights in the U.S. is a reminder that democracy is not just a given. It's something that needs protecting and nurturing by each generation. Thank you for joining me on this look back at the evolution of voting rights in the U.S. From the days when only a few could vote to the ongoing work to make voting fair and accessible for all, this history shows how far we've come and how important it is to stay engaged. If you found this video interesting, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories from history. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is the next step for voting rights in America? Until next time, keep learning and stay curious.